Yeshu bar Nagara, the son of the craftsman, or carpenter, as he is called, was an Israelite from the Davidic line who came to Palestine some 2,000 years ago with his mother, aunt, and brothers. Later, he was joined by his wife, Mary Magdalene. He came with the same goal in mind as his grandfather Zerubbabel, which was to overthrow the Herodian dynasty and re-establish the kingdom of David in Judea. This would allow all Israelites to live freely and be liberated from Roman rule. He traveled from village to village, gathering supporters around him. Gradually, the Pharisees became aware of his movement. The Pharisees were Jews of non-Israeli heritage who enjoyed certain privileges under Roman rule and were content with the status quo. Thus, when Jesus, the troublemaker, came along, he constituted a threat to their position. These were the same Pharisees who had prevented Jesus' grandfather from attaining the same goal before. It was not in their interest to have an Israeli declared as king. They tried to subdue him with promises and warnings, but to no avail. Finally, they conspired against him, arrested him, and presented him before Pilate. He was tried for treason and crucified. This was the end of the story. His loyal followers held close to his teachings and lived with the hope that someday things would change in Palestine, and they would have the opportunity to re-establish the unified kingdom. These Israelites who lived in Palestine originated from Arabia. They were all descendants of the era of David and Solomon, whose kingdom was far south in the Assur region of the Hijaz, not too far from Yemen. The followers of Yeshu, Jesus, continued to multiply in number and were being persecuted by the Pharisee clergy. But no one was more enthusiastic about persecuting them than a man named Saul. He admits it himself in his letters, as I will soon show you. He kept on killing them, exiling them, imprisoning them, you name it. Their movement could not be stopped, and there seemed to be no solution to the headache they were causing and the threat they posed to the Herodian rule. Then, this Saul received a vision, as he called it, of Jesus appearing to him in a dream and telling him to go to Damascus. So, he heeded the call, packed his gear and traveled eastward to meet an important but somewhat reclusive figure called Ananias, a Jewish rabbi of some renown in the region. It was there, in Damascus, that the diabolical plot of Ananias was prepared.
Do you want to get rid of their movement?
Of course.
Here's what you do. Go south into Arabia and bring me the scrolls which contain historical information and legends about a man, a prophet, named Isa, son of Miriam. Bring them to me and I will then tell you what you need to do.
Saul disappeared for 3 years and managed to return to Ananias with the scrolls. These artifacts apparently contained information, no doubt legendized by the mystic Nassaras of Arabia, about a man named Isa, who lived 1,000 years earlier, was said to have been born of a virgin, and who was completely unknown to the Israelites in Palestine, the followers of Jesus the troublemaker.
Here's what you must do. You cannot get rid of them physically, so you corrupt their creed. You change their beliefs. You must preach to them the truth about Yeshu. He did not come to liberate them from oppressive Roman rule. No, he came to die on the cross as the Son of God, to absolve all humanity of its sins.
And the rest, my friends, became history. Ananias took all that was known about Isa, son of Miriam, truths and legends combined, and dumped them onto the figure of Jesus. There you have it, the birth of Christianity as we know it. Saul traveled back with this new creed, changed his demeanor to good Christian soul, changed his name to Paul, and all hell broke loose. Paul was by nature a very violent man. He could not have come up with an idea like that. Only a diabolical genius could concoct a plan this sinister. But Paul was convinced to try because he had nothing to lose. The true mastermind was his teacher Ananias. At first, the followers of Jesus, whose memory was still fresh, he died barely 10 years before, refused to accept Paul's manipulations. But later on, when the idea was backed by Rome itself, in all its might, when Emperor Constantine himself declared himself embracing of it, and his banning, in the Council of Nicaea, of any idea, writing, or movement that contradicted Paul's idea, it propagated like the plague. It had an effect that not even Paul could have dreamed of. Who exactly is Paul? Paul was a mysterious figure about whom very little is known. From what we do know, he was a militant figure who worked as head of intelligence in Roman Judea, and had an insatiable enthusiasm for persecuting the followers of Jesus' purely political movement, a movement whose members sought the opportunity to overthrow Roman rule and establish their own independent state in Palestine. Ananias, a diabolically brilliant Jew, was the brains behind the creation of entirely new beliefs about Jesus, which he sought to spread to put an end to his followers' movement. Paul was the brawn, the tool that Ananias used to spread these false and corrupting ideas from which the Christianity that is rampant today was born. Paul was indeed a shadowy figure. His actual birthdate and upbringing location are not known for certain. It is for this reason that the Christian Church does not encourage talk about the history of his personal life. In fact, he himself, in his letters, describes himself as being as crafty as a chameleon lizard, changing his colors as the occasion saw fit. He was a Jew when around Jews and a Roman when among Romans, so to speak. Paul appeared suddenly in Palestine years after the crucifixion of Jesus, whom he never saw or met in person. We know that he was born in Tarsus, present-day Syria, which was then known to be a hub for Greek pagan beliefs. He was not among the descendants of Israel. In fact, he did not fully embrace Judaism until his middle years, upon which he claimed he became a fanatic. Luke says the following about him.
And Saul was consenting to his death. And on that day a great persecution arose against the church in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the region of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen, and made great lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church, and entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison.
So, based on what we do know about him, he was part of the Roman intelligence forces in Palestine, so to speak, and had full authority to silence the followers of Jesus' liberation movement by whatever means necessary. In fact, this is what Paul himself declares.
I am a Jew, born at Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, educated according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God as you all are this day. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of elders bear me witness. From them, I received letters to the brethren, and I journeyed to Damascus, to take those also who were there, and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem, to be punished.
In his letters, Saul tells of how his feelings towards Jesus changed when Jesus appeared to him in a dream while he was on his way to Damascus to persecute the remaining members of the movement. It was from that very moment that Saul underwent a drastic transformation, and he later became the first preacher of what was to become Christianity as we know it today.
But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that, if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he journeyed, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed about him. And he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him,
Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?
And he said,
Who are you, Lord?
And he said,
I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, but rise, and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do.
According to what we just read, this alleged vision took place when Saul was on his way to Damascus to persecute the remaining members of Jesus' movement who had fled from Judea. The truth of this matter is very doubtful for the simple reason that Damascus was, at the time, completely out of Rome's jurisdiction. It was thus very unlikely that Saul, or any other figure representing Roman authority for that matter, could have simply stormed into Damascus and arrested members of the opposition to Roman rule who were present there. This is in fact confirmed by Chaim Maccabi in his book Paul and the Perversion of Christianity, where he mentions that Damascus, at the time, was part of the Nabatean kingdom ever since Emperor Caligula relinquished Roman hold over it in the year +37. Damascus was ruled by a maniacal Arab monarch known as Al-Harith, who was never known to make any compromise as far as his sovereignty or authority was concerned. It was very unlikely that Al-Harith, who was an enemy of Rome, would allow a figure of Roman authority to march all the way from Judea and persecute anyone who lived in his domain. Yet, understanding what exactly happened in Damascus holds the key to grasping how Christianity, as we know it today, was born. For it was upon Saul's return from Damascus that he began to preach the new beliefs about Jesus. This new creed held that Jesus had not come to liberate the Israeli Jews from foreign rule and establish an independent state for them, as Jesus himself had claimed when he told the Canaanite Jewish woman who came asking him to heal her child. I quote, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Meaning, the kingdom that Jesus envisioned was for the Israelis only, a statement clearly smacking of political racism. Rather, Jesus had come to absolve all of humanity from their sins by dying on the cross, and the kingdom he wished to establish was in heaven, not on earth. This idea served as opium to appease the people, the followers of Jesus at their forefront, so they would no longer entertain any rebellious ideas towards Roman rule. This drastic turn of events begs the following question: how could Saul, who believed that violence and physical extermination were the most effective ways to silence the followers of Jesus, transform into a devious manipulator and preach a new creed of peace and love, whose effect on the movement was far more destructive than any force of arms or physical extermination? The answer to this question is hidden within the folds of the NT's pages, in the letters of the apostles to be precise, and anyone who examines these letters with an open mind and reads between the lines, so to speak, will surely find the answer. In Saul's alleged vision, we find that Jesus asked him to go to Damascus and await further instructions there. Let us see what the NT itself says.
And I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me,
Rise, and go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do.
And when I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me, and came into Damascus. A man named Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews, who lived there, came to me, and standing by me, said to me,
Brother Saul, receive your sight.
And, in that very hour, I received my sight and saw him. And he said,
The God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the just one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him, to all men, of what you have seen and heard. And now, why do you wait? Rise and be baptized, and wash away your sins, calling on his name.
The passage asserts, from the mouth of Saul himself, that it was not Jesus who told Saul what was to be done, nor was it he who instructed him as to the nature of the new preaching. What happened was that Saul met another Jewish man of some renown, who went by the name of Ananias. This Jewish man, a citizen of Damascus, which was then a part of Nabatea, also did not wish to witness the rise of an independent kingdom for the Israelites in Palestine and wanted to put an end to the freedom movement of Jesus' followers. This Ananias had the patience, intelligence, and craftiness to know exactly which approach was most effective, for he had been closely monitoring the activities of the Roman authorities in their hunt for members of the movement. He understood full well that neither physical extermination nor imprisonment could weaken their resolve. On the contrary, such actions would only increase people's sympathy towards the movement and possibly draw more members to it. So he concocted a devious, subtle, but more effective way to silence it by corrupting the movement to its very core. Ananias also understood that if there was ever anyone who was qualified to carry out this diabolical task, anyone with the enthusiasm and energy to see it done, it was none other than Saul himself. Here is another passage from the NT asserting that Ananias also saw Jesus in a vision and told Saul that he had been chosen by the Lord to carry out the task.
Now there was a disciple at Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision,
Ananias.
And he said,
Here I am, Lord.
And the Lord said to him,
Rise and go to the street called Straight, and inquire in the house of Judas for a man of Tarsus named Saul, for behold, he is praying. And he has seen a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight.
But Ananias answered,
Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to thy saints at Jerusalem, and here, he has authority from the chief priests to bind all who call upon your name.
But the Lord said to him,
Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel, for I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name.
So Ananias departed and entered the house, and laying his hands on him he said,
Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road by which you came, has sent me that you may regain your sight, and be filled with the Holy Spirit.
And immediately something like scales fell from his eyes, and he regained his sight. Then he rose and was baptized, and took food, and was strengthened. For several days he was with the disciples at Damascus.
Now the truth is beginning to emerge. It was Ananias, a Jewish priest, who brainwashed Saul and put him under the illusion that the God of our ancestors, as Ananias himself labeled him, meaning the ancient God of the Jews, not Jesus, had chosen Saul to preach new ideas to the people concerning Jesus' true identity and mission. These new ideas were, of course, completely unheard of and unfathomable to the followers of Jesus' movement at the time. It was not a vision that Saul saw which prompted him to change his approach towards Jesus' followers, but rather it was his trip to Damascus, whether for the purpose of persecuting members of the movement, as he claimed, or to accept a personal invitation from Ananias. This change in approach could not have come from Saul himself, who was, by nature a man of violent action. It must have been planted in his head by one who was more devious. Saul was simply the tool to carry out the diabolical plan of the architect Ananias. The brainwashing of Saul required 3 years to be accomplished, and was orchestrated in several stages. Stage 1, the conviction. Ananias had to convince Saul, the prime persecutor of Jesus' followers, that Jesus had appeared to him in a dream and was very perturbed because of this persecution. He asked Saul to cease and desist. He also had to convince Saul that he was chosen by the God of the Jewish ancestors to preach new principles about Jesus, who had died before being able to deliver them to his followers. Saul truly believed that Ananias had seen Jesus in a dream, So he announced his readiness to cease all forms of persecution of Jesus' followers and devote his entire life to absolving himself of the horrors he had perpetrated against them. Ananias brainwashed Saul into unquestionably believing that he was doing a service to the ancestral God of the Jews. Thus, Saul became like soft dough, easily manipulated by Ananias. Stage 2. The birth of a new creed. Ananias came to the realization that the most effective way to put an end to any rebellious threat against Roman authority in Palestine was to assign to Jesus, the man who had come into Palestine as a stranger and whose father was hence unknown to the people of Judea, certain attributes that some Jews had assigned, in bygone days, to a true messenger of God by the name of Isa, son of Miriam, who had been sent to the Israelites in Arabia. Many legends had seeped into the story of Isa, no doubt the result of embellishments by mystics from among the Nazara throughout the many centuries separating Jesus' time from Isa's. Among these legends that were rampant at the time of Saul's visit to Damascus, and his trip further south into Arabia, as we shall soon see, was that this Isa was the Son of God. Since the goal of this new creed was to silence the rebellious movement of Jesus' followers in Judea and surrounding territories, Ananias saw it fit to make those followers believe that Jesus hadn't come to establish an earthly and independent state for the Israelites but rather that he was the Son of God who had come to die on the cross to absolve all of humanity of their sins and establish for them a kingdom in heaven. As such, Ananias had to spoon-feed Saul the creed of the Nazara, which was completely unknown to Saul. All that remained of this creed was preserved in scriptures penned in one of the languages of Arabia, most probably Aramaic, which was also alien to Saul, who was born in Tarsus, Asia Minor, and had lived all his life in Palestine, whose inhabitants spoke Greek or Roman. It is highly likely that Ananias needed more information about the Nasara's beliefs, and so he sent Saul on a trip to Arabia to salvage what could be salvaged of written scriptures, without any fear that Saul might discover the truth of Ananias' scheme, for he was completely oblivious as to the content of these scriptures he was sent to retrieve. And so it was that Saul did indeed travel to Arabia, as he himself states.
But when he, who had set me apart before I was born, and had called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not confer with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem, to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia, and again I returned to Damascus. Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem, to visit Cephas, and remained with him 15 days.
Now comes the question, what did Saul do in Arabia? What was the purpose of his trip there and his mysterious disappearance for 3 years in that alien land? Christian scholars themselves have been, and continue to be, baffled by this. Most of them claim that Saul made the trip to that faraway land in order to find peace and tranquility, to clear himself from the turmoil burning within him, and to better condition himself for his mission. This, of course, is mere speculation. If the purpose was to condition himself or be at peace, he might well have traveled to some secluded grove or wilderness not far from Damascus. Instead, he traveled over 1,000 kilometers into Arabia, which means there must have been a truly important purpose for the trip. Although Paul didn't state this purpose clearly, we need to read between the lines and look at the bigger picture to deduce what the purpose of the trip was. In any case, it seems that Saul returned from Arabia with some scrolls, which he immediately delivered to Ananias. In his excellent book, Who Was Jesus?, Kamal Salabi states the following: it is likely that what Saul found in Arabia and returned with to Damascus were the rukuk, parchments of animal skin, which he mentioned in his second letter sent from his prison in Rome to his beloved son Timothy in his later days. The letter that Salabi is referring to is the following:
Do your best to come to me quickly, for Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful in serving me. Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. When you come, bring the cloak that I left with Carpus at Troas, also the books, and above all the parchments.
Stage 3, the teaching. The most obvious proof we have to support the claim that it was Ananias who planted in Saul's head the idea that he had been chosen by God to bear the message of the new principles concerning Jesus is that upon completing his mission in Arabia, Saul did not immediately head towards Jerusalem to begin his preaching because, up until that point, he still had no idea what it was that he had to preach. Instead, he returned to Damascus first to deliver to Ananias the parchments he had recovered from the land of the Nazara. Ananias studied these parchments extensively for 3 years and finally decided to attribute to Jesus all that the Nazarene believed about Isa, the son of Miriam, a true messenger who had been sent by God to the Israelites of Arabia many centuries before. He also embellished the story with some pagan beliefs that were rampant in Judea and Syria at the time. Saul remained in Damascus for 3 years, taking Ananias' teachings to heart, as he himself asserts in his letters. Stage 4, the preaching. After 3 years of training for his new responsibility under the tutelage of Ananias, Saul changed his name to Paul, a necessary precaution, for the people of Jerusalem needed to forget the old Saul, whose name was symbolic of the violent persecution of Jesus' followers. Indeed, Paul actually began his very first preaching while still in Damascus, but it seemed that the Jewish minority in that city did not like what they heard and conspired to kill Paul. Eventually, with the help of Ananias' men, he was rather comically smuggled out of Damascus walls in a basket by night.
And in the synagogues immediately he proclaimed Jesus, saying,
He is the Son of God.
And all who heard him were amazed, and said,
Isn't this the same man who caused such devastation among Jesus' followers in Jerusalem? And didn't he come here to arrest them and take them in chains to the leading priests?
But Saul increased all the more in strength, and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Christ. After many days had gone by, there was a conspiracy among the Jews to kill him, but their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night to kill him. But his disciples took him by night and let him down over the wall, lowering him in a basket.
Paul then went immediately to Jerusalem to meet with Jesus' brothers and disciples, who by that time were led by Jacob, and tried unsuccessfully to get them to abandon their beliefs concerning Jesus. Paul stayed in Jerusalem for a mere 15 days before he was forced to redirect his course toward Cilicia again.
But I saw none of the other apostles except James the Lord's brother. I assure you before God that what I am writing you is no lie. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still not known by sight to the churches of Christ in Judea. All they knew was that people were saying,
He who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy.
And they glorified God because of me.
The real reason for Paul's hasty departure from Jerusalem was no doubt the instruction of Ananias, who clearly did not want him to spread the new faith among Jews. Proof of this fact comes straight from Paul's mouth.
When I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me,
Make haste and get quickly out of Jerusalem, because they will not accept your testimony about me.
And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval, and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. And he said to me,
Depart, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles.
This is another example of Paul's tendency to claim these visions. It is very likely that it wasn't Jesus whom he saw but rather an actual man, a messenger from Ananias, telling him to return at once to Cilicia. The wisdom of starting the preaching of the new faith in the non-Jewish land of Cilicia was completely oblivious to the short-sighted Paul, but not so to the devious Ananias, whose goal was to end a rebellious movement, not spread a new religion among the Jews, which might endanger their ancient beliefs. Thus, Cilicia was a wise choice for the following reasons. It was Saul's country of birth, and most of its inhabitants held Greek or pagan beliefs, which explains why in Paul's vision, Jesus told him to send word to the Gentiles. If some of the inhabitants of Cilicia, a country that is relatively far from Jerusalem, had heard of Jesus' failed attempt at rebellion against the Romans, the memory of those events must have, by that time, become blurry in their minds because over 10 years had passed since his crucifixion, and because most of Cilicia's inhabitants were Gentiles. The country constituted a perfect environment for the spread of beliefs about the identity of Jesus that were drastically different from what was already known. Ananias knew that it would not be long before this new creed would spread, its influence would eventually reach Jerusalem, and it would be nurtured at the expense of people forgetting Jesus' true identity and the goal he had come to Judea to achieve. This is exactly what Ananias wanted all along. And so it was that Paul's preaching spread all around the pagan world, and people gradually began to hear about a man named Jesus, who allegedly was born in Palestine some 40 years earlier from a virgin mother, and was God's only begotten son. This man lived as an ordinary human among humans so that his Father, God, could better learn the nature of his creations. According to Paul, God could not understand why humans were prone to sin, ever since Adam ate the fruit of the forbidden tree. So he sent his Son to live among them to better understand their nature. God eventually became convinced that humans could not refrain from committing sin because it was in their very nature to do so. God then had to correct his mistake, since he could not punish his creations for committing something that was in their very nature. So, he made his only begotten Son die on the cross to absolve humanity of its sins. Such was the creed founded by the diabolical Ananias and spoon-fed to Paul. No longer could good deeds and kindness to fellow man and honesty toward the Creator alone pave the way to paradise for humanity. Rather, it was belief in Jesus as the Son of God and his sacrifice on the cross alone that became the key to salvation. Such was the destructive opium that he subtly injected to curb the determination of Jesus' followers. And so Paul began preaching a new creed that was based on attributing falsehoods to Jesus, claims that Jesus never made. This was how Christianity was born. For 3 centuries, most people did not accept Paul's ideas and secretly resisted them. In fact, Paul's ideas would gain leverage only when Roman Emperor Constantine declared his embracing of Paul's creed in the beginning of the 4th century AD and introduced many pagan elements that were rampant in the region at that time to make it more acceptable and attractive to the Gentiles. It was this Christianity, propelled by the political and economic might of Rome, which eventually flourished far beyond the wildest dreams or intentions of Ananias and his pupil.